Audio and questions. All lines have been muted to ensure high quality audio, and this webinar is being recorded. Have any questions or issues, please type in the Q&A box at any time. Course and webinar recordings you may like. You can view them all at federallabs.org/learning-center. Have a topic for a webinar? We always need proposals and speakers for interesting webinars. Submit your ideas today. Email Teresa Hurt at thurt@federallabs.org. Welcome to FLC Webinar. What's in a name? Public perceptions of technology transfer. Today, we'll like to introduce today's speakers. Mark Skinner, working with SSTI since 1998, lead developer for SSTI annual conference content, and serves as the editor at the SSTI Weekly Digest. Jason Rittenberg, Policy and Development Director for SSTI. His work includes coordinating SSTI's policy activities, cultivating partnerships and projects opportunities, and contributing to the SSTI Weekly Digest and research projects. Let's welcome Mark and Jason.
Great, thank you very much for that, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, Jason Rittenberg with SSTI, very happy to be talking with all of you today. So we're going to be talking today, as the title of the presentation says, about public perceptions of technology transfer. And in particular, we will be focusing on a survey project that we have undertaken mostly earlier this year to talk a lot with the general public about how they understand technology transfer, but also science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We're dialing in some cases to look at both general phrases, understanding of definitions, responses to particular passages that the public receive to help them understand the work that we all do, but then also in some cases looking at specific terms and how people respond to those terms as well. And obviously the idea here is that if we can understand better what people hear and what they understand when we're speaking with them, then we can hopefully do a better job of conveying the meaning, the purpose, the value of all the work that you all do. So I will be going through playing today's, in some way, play-by-play commentator of the survey project, and then Mark Skinner will be our color commentator, jumping in with the important on the field, on the ground insights, as well as taking lead on some of the other sections as well. So we wanted to start off our time today by giving everyone a little bit of a quiz perhaps. Actually, I apologize, looks like I lost control of the ability to advance the slide. So if you can go to the next one or get that, there we go, perfect, thank you. So I wanted to start off today with a question for all of you to try to get a sense of what you think the public understands when we talk about technology transfer. And so the best way I thought to perhaps frame this would be, how would your parents define technology transfer? And if you would go ahead and chat this in through the question box, I would appreciate that. And we'll see what people's kind of understanding is, or what your idea is of what that public perception is now. While we're waiting for a few of those responses to come in, first to the facilitators and then to us, I will share that I asked my mother this question last night, and the definition that she had, or her best guess, I guess I should say, perhaps not a definition, was that technology transfer had to do with moving files from one computer to another. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, that was actually not an uncommon perception that people have. So Holly or Teresa, I don't know if anybody is sharing what they think their parents would define technology transfer as. Understandably, people thinking that their parents would not have a clue at all. Setting up their new iPhone, yep, a lot of IT types of questions. And as Mark and I have been talking about the responses that we've seen so far, it does seem that tech has become relatively synonymous with IT in so many people's minds. Certainly tech news is generally going to be about IT, so you can kind of understand why people might have that perception. All right, well, someone said moving inventions to the public sector. That at least would be much more in the ballpark. So good job for that person's parents. Excellent. All right, well, we'll look through some more of these and talk through them. I appreciate you guys sharing some of those. While those continue to come in, let's just provide an overview of what we were doing with the project here. So this is actually not the first time that SSTI set out to measure the public's perception of science, tech, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We actually, back in 2015, did a very similar project where we had a focus group followed by a public opinion survey. And really, because that was the first time that we had done it, we wanted to try to understand what is the public perception of this work, and how do we talk about the work, and how is that resonating with people. Really didn't know what to expect. Obviously, you see many policy areas that are pretty starkly divided in terms of partisanship or education level or many other common divides that we have in society. And frankly, many of us speak in a way that includes a lot of jargon in ways that we don't even think about. And so I wanted to get a better handle on how that came about. We'll talk about some of those results as we go on today. The follow-up that we completed this year was really then focused on how those public perceptions of the field changed over the past 5 years. Obviously, there's been a lot of news coverage of science and questioning of science, I should say, in that news coverage at time over the past 5 years. So we were really curious if that had had a measurable impact in public perceptions of the work that's being done in this field. And also we wanted to add on to our knowledge and understanding from what we achieved in 2015 to dig deeper into the likes and dislikes that people expressed. Did we go 2 slides? Here we go. So in terms of the methodology of what we did, just to provide a little bit more detail here, we had an online focus group, and that was held on March 9th. That was a smaller person group. It was a couple dozen people, a little bit more than that, perhaps, I think 28 or so, people who gave us a lot of time, a lot of detail in their responses, very specifically to the questions and terms, help us understand not just how favorable the responses were, but also what some of the thinking was behind some of the specific terms, really help provide some color to the survey that we ultimately did of 800 likely voters between March 17th and 21 of 2020. And I want to point out that we used a bipartisan polling team in order to do this, so that we can make sure that our questions, at least as far as the pollsters believed, would kind of resonate, be understood by people on different political sides of the spectrum. So one point that I want to make, because it's come up in pretty much every conversation that we've had about this project, is that you'll notice those dates, March 17th through 21st. That's right at the time that a lot of states were really starting to buckle down and take the coronavirus very seriously. And so naturally, we've received a lot of questions about how valid and how kind of continuously resonant some of these responses are that we'll talk about today. And from our perspective, and also from the polling team's perspective, we think that there is a lot of value still in the results that we have. We did ask questions about people's opinion of the recession and of coronavirus, and people were already starting to understand it. But one of the things that came through in the study is that they really think about science and innovation as being something that's valuable over the very long term. And so something that was being perceived as a shorter term concern wouldn't necessarily be factoring in too significantly into how they would feel about the field. Perhaps more importantly, though, again, since we asked many of these questions, both 2015 and 2020, we were able to observe a lot of consistency in responses, and actually people were slightly more favorable in 2020. I think also there's been so much attention on the importance that medical science and innovations are going to have to being able to move forward through this pandemic, that would also speak well to, if anything, hopefully people would recognize the value of the work that you're doing more so by the end of this whole process, not less. Mark, I don't know if you had any other points you wanted to make on the method or the timing.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember March 9th, how many states had shut down at that point or gone into lockdown, and I don't think it was terribly many. I myself was in California at that point, and San Diego had 1 case, I think, and so there wasn't, it was still very much a China and New York thing from my perspective, but it was in the news a lot because we were trying to figure it out. That could be wrong, correct me on that, but, and then by March 17th, you know, a number of states had shut down, and it was very like, all right, is this a short-term thing? We'll get past it. But But I think the advantage that we all, well, not advantage, but the positive, if there is one out of it, is people see such a role for innovation, all aspects of innovation and how we go forward, even with a vaccine. So.
Right there.
So related to that, if you're unable to stay on the whole time, or just really wanted to emphasize a few of the big takeaway, and that is the amount of support that people have for the work in the innovation space itself, but then again, particularly in tech transfer, we added much more specific questions around the tech transfer community and the work you guys do, some of the word association things that we added or incorporated. Once they understand it, they like it. And that's the point of the conversation today. Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the slide, we do have links to some of the memos we've put out about the more policy related questions and people's responses to that. So if you're interested, I do encourage you to look at those and feel free to follow up with us as well. The public very strongly supported the prompts and the policy ideas that we gave them. So you should feel very well supported in that regard, at least. So now go ahead, we will dig into some of the commonly used words and phrases that are in the trade. And want to start off with this chart. I encourage you to go back and look at it in more detail on your own time. We'll talk about just some of the items that are on here today, but we still did want to provide the whole thing for you. A couple of notes about what you're looking at on this page before we move on and discuss those items in more detail. So first of all, these are sorted in terms of the green bar, which is the very favorable response, but the green and yellow portions of the bar together represent the total favorability that people reported when they read the term that you see listed there on the left. That asterisk next to converting research is because I just shortened it for the purpose of the table here. That was the one place where instead of more of a straight term, we gave them a little bit more of a phrase. What people were responding to there was converting research into jobs and businesses. And that idea, again, when expressed a little bit more lengthy, was resonating very strongly with people. You can see about 84–85% favorability overall. The gray bar in the middle represents essentially overall uncertainty about the phrase. We combined, for sake of ease, people who said that they didn't know what the term meant or were ambivalent about it or had no opinion on it whatsoever. So you see towards the bottom there, in some cases you have more of an unfavorable response represented by red, but you're also seeing a lot less certainty about what those terms are even supposed to mean, or ambivalence about them perhaps. All right. And to highlight on here, you see some of the key terms that are very relevant to FLC and the work that you all do in the tech transfer offices and the labs as being ones that do generate a lot of uncertainty among people. Of course, federal lab and technology transfer are two of the bottom 5 terms in terms of overall favorability. Perhaps fortunately, when viewed as an educational opportunity, though, it's not so much exactly that the responses and the ranking of those terms is because of the unfavorable responses, but really you're seeing a lot of uncertainty, lack of clarity on what the terms mean and what's being expressed when people are responding to those terms. And so you're seeing very large gray sections of the bar, around 30% for each of those terms. So to look a little bit more first at federal lab, you can see 16% of people are very favorable about it, 35% somewhat favorable. One important thing to understand is that the federal part of this term very likely is a pretty significant part of the negative response there. One thing that we saw in the 2015 study in particular is that even when you looked at federal research versus scientific research, people are much more negative about federal research. It called into their minds a lot of other different things. Someone referenced shrimp on a treadmill, which I believe goes back to a report that one member of Congress used to do on what he viewed as wasted research grants. That person perhaps paying a little close attention and recalling that to their minds. But again, the point is that federal doesn't necessarily do any favors. The good news is that, as you're seeing in these terms that came from the focus group, there was a lot of very positive responses that people who at least had a good response were able to call to mind. So providing innovative technology, certainly a good one. We need this right now to handle the virus. Again, speaking to how people might be able to grow and change their opinions over the course of time and through the pandemic in particular. So there are some good tools to work with here, but looking at only about 50% favorability overall, and nearly a third of the people not really being sure enough about the term to have an opinion on it, definitely a challenge. Mark, before we go on to the next term, see if there was anything you wanted to add on there.
Yeah, can you bounce back to the slide before?
Yeah.
All right. There's so much in this slide that we're not going to have time to get into, but I want to highlight a couple of things. One, China at this point in the COVID crisis was all over the news because most of the cases were there, and at least they were getting the blame for whether, people saying this was intentional or not. I suspect if we had done this a month or so earlier, China wouldn't have been as bad. And then also, it was interesting, the economic development, fourth on the list there from the top, when people were asked to do word association with that, the things that they listed as economic development were much more in what's traditionally considered the community development space, housing, neighborhood improvement, safer streets, better lighting. And so it gets to the issue of when we say something, we think it means a certain thing, but folks are starting from their perspective and not necessarily aligned with us as we go. That's it.
Yeah, certainly fair points. So you saw again and again with these terms that people kind of understand them on their face value, certainly not what they mean to people who are in the field. So looking at technology transfer, again, this term had about a third of people who weren't sure what the phrase was actually designed to mean. So anytime you're trying to have a group of people respond to what your organization is, and then they're not even sure what the term actually means when you're using it, that suggests that there's going to be a problem in communicating effectively. So we really want to dig into technology transfer in a lot more detail here. And so first, I think it's useful to have a conversation here about jargon and its impact on communication.
Yeah, I think the critical thing here for us to really take to heart from both the survey and our interaction with folks is we might be using the second or third definition in a dictionary all the time, and folks are on page one, right, or on that top definition. And when we speak about even economic development or commercialization or tech transfer, we're using it as jargon. And a scientific or an empirical study, a professor who spent her whole career so far studying how the public perceives technical terms, Hillary Schulman at Ohio State, showed that even when you explain or provide people the definition, they still have a hard time following the, stepping aside from their entrenched paradigm around those thoughts. But then I also thought it was interesting here in this particular paper, her conclusion, that third bullet there, she slipped into jargon. So we end up with, what the hell is she talking about again? And so it's hard to avoid. And that's all the point this slide's about.
So before getting into this slide, I will say, gotten a couple of good questions about value of communicating with the general public about these terms. That's something we'll definitely talk more toward the end of this. Certainly understand that question, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Just want to acknowledge that we're getting good questions. Please keep those coming. Happy to engage with people on this, absolutely. So on this slide and in the study, we essentially had three different phrases that, from a broad perspective, are essentially talking about the same process with different types of terms and really getting very different responses from the public. So the first one there is technology transfer. The second one is commercialization. And the third one is, again, that phrase that we use, converting research into jobs and businesses. And I realize that especially from within the field. These are maybe to some people talking about different things, but especially from at a broad level, these are relatively dealing with the same type of process about ways to get research from the labs and into the hands of businesses that can put it to work. Again, looking at very different responses there, you can see that broad band of people who are very uncertain about the term for technology transfer, commercialization pulling in a lot more negative responses, converting research into jobs and businesses coming up very positively. So to dig a bit more into these responses and what's behind each of them, let's start with commercialization. So this one, the bottom line takeaway is that when people hear commercialization, they are hearing commercialism. Both in 2015 and in the 2020 focus groups, we had people who said that this is what's destroying Christmas. And so that's definitely not something that you want the work that you're doing at the federal labs or work that you're doing with partners outside of the lab perhaps to be associated with ruining Christmas for people. Other comments that we got is that commercialization is why every town has the same restaurants, harmful to mom and pop businesses. There you see on the slide as part of the response. So a lot of this is what's behind the very strong unfavorables that you're getting to this term. Plus about 20% of the people, perhaps understandably, aren't sure what the term means anyway. So really using the term commercialization outside of a very, very narrow audience of your peers, it's really not getting you very much traction. So on this phrase, which we had tested out in 2015 and have really started using a lot more since then ourselves, when you talk about converting research into jobs and businesses, taking a few extra seconds, but really trying to define the process a little bit more instead of using the term that was clearly confusing people, we're seeing very strong reactions to this. So again, you can see about 84% of people overall were very positive about the phrase converting research into jobs and businesses. Some of the responses that came up during the focus group, as you can see there on the slide, include things like helping new fields that provide jobs, practical use of grant money, something that certainly you want to hear as a good public steward of funds. And when you're looking at the flip side of the coin, only 9% unfavorable and 6% were confused or did not have an opinion on the term. So certainly doing much more to convey the value and the purpose of the work than the other phrase that we had looked at before.
And Jason, let me jump in here for a second. I was reminded that a lot of offices, particularly university offices of technology transfer, to try to step away from the process that tech transfer represents rather than the outcomes, started calling themselves offices of commercialization. And we may have been shooting ourselves in the foot when we were doing that. So rebranding, I think, is important, but we have to think about exactly what those terms are going forward.
Absolutely.
That sounded like a very color commentary kind of thing to say, didn't it? So that's why I did it.
That was perfect. You had that anecdote experience there.
Yeah, just.
Well, that's good, Mark. All right. So the focus group prompt, for technology transfer, instead of having a slide like we had for the past couple, we really dug into this a lot more, particularly with the focus group. And so we're going to provide even more detail on responses to technology transfer than what we had for the other phrases. So during the focus group, this was the initial way that we tested people's understanding of the term. We said some people involved in this project use the term technology transfer. What does that term mean to you? And so 92% of the people who responded did not know. They provided a definition that was really not correct, or they provided one, but it was wrong.
Yeah, and of course, by wrong, we mean it wasn't what we were expecting from the perspective of your jobs. And so this is what they put, or this is what they told us it meant. And again, we did this, we did some word association and we gave them a sense for what the whole topic of the focus group was going to be. And then we just put this question out there to them. So 10% thought it was the exchange of information between people, like social media. 33%, like Jason's mom, thought that it was transferring information from one technology to another, particularly when you bought a new phone. 6% thought it was related to automation and technology taking over the jobs for individuals. So it was the transfer of jobs, work that we used to do, to automation. 2% thought it was related to helping developing countries and us deploying appropriate technology to their situation. 33%, as we've said, just didn't have a clue. And 8% said that this is the stuff for the future. These are the research ideas and the technology that will lead us into the future, as opposed to necessarily today. So that left 8% to get it right. And because it was an online focus group, people had, you couldn't go to the next question until you responded to this one. And the one really right question or answer, this one sort of, we're relatively sure they did a Google search of the phrase and then pasted in the response, because one can do a Google search on that once you get past uneducated guess, and you'll come up with a couple of different university commercialization sites. So obviously we have to put what we're saying in context.
So later in the focus group, we gave people the definition that I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you because we borrowed it from the Federal Labs website. And so we asked people to read through the definition of technology transfer that you see here on the slide and then respond to this one. So, and out of curiosity, I know I said show of hands, but if you would like to go ahead and chat in a response instead so that we can take a look at those. I'm curious, how many of you use this definition or something that is very close to it in your regular lab communications? Whether that's related to any success stories, publications, annual reports you may do on your website, talking about the work that your office does. So again, we'd just love to know.
Jason, if you could put it back up for him. Or not.
There we go. For some reason, I couldn't find the arrows.
Yeah, so this is, we lifted this specifically from the Federal Lab website.
All right, excellent. So seeing a handful of people, looks like 3 or 4 responses, people who have chimed in and said that yes, they use something that's almost directly or exactly that language. John Fraser saying that they work with researchers to find companies that convert research results into products that can save lives, improve quality of life, and increase the productivity and competitiveness of companies. Excellent. That sounds like something much closer to what we were talking about with the different definitions. So good to see that. Yep, excellent. Other people talking about how they use something that is simpler as well and try to put it into terms that their business partners will understand. All right, all very fair. And actually, set you up a little bit, or those of you who said that you use the original definition, not that we're actually going to recommend it, we'll dig into that more in a moment, but actually when people were even given this definition that you might see as being perhaps a bit bureaucratic or legalistic, people still responded overall pretty positively to it. But digging into that more, there's some very specific reactions here of what part of it generates positivity and what doesn't. So when you look at the beginning of the definition, technology transfer is the process by which existing knowledge, facilities, or capabilities developed under federal R&D funding are utilized to fulfill public and private needs. This part does get a positive response from people. When we look though at the next part, this is the part that raises a bit more questions in people's minds, and we think most likely, well, both looking at the focus groups, and so we know, but then also just based on some of the past research that we've done in public perceptions, talking about taxpayers, reminding people that about taxing doesn't tend to go over very positively. Bringing up federal labs, again, we saw the uncertainty around that before and spoke a bit about the negativity around federal in general. And then talking about not just the names of laws, which can sound boring to many people, but then pointing out that these are rather old laws at that doesn't necessarily come across as particularly inspiring to the general public.
Yeah, if I
And
can.
then to look at the third
If we can jump back to
definition
that.
here, and yeah, go ahead, Mark.
If we can jump back to the last one.
Yep.
I want to give people a sense for how we determined that those words weren't particularly liked. So in the focus group, folks were able to highlight specific words and then provide us text or comments as to what they liked or disliked about that. So that's part of how we're able to say that opening sentence or clause was really well liked because of the kind of comments that people gave us related to those words. And interestingly, I'll point out one of the sentences. Oh no, wait, I won't say that now. But then in this section, these single words, taxpayers, there were seven, excuse me, specific comments where people said they really didn't like this word. And things like, I like that they at least act like they want to smartly invest our money instead of just chucking large sums at people. And do not want taxpayer money in this. This should be a private sector initiative. So, and I don't like that this is singled out, that only taxpayers are singled out. Those kind of things, think about. We think by representing, all right, we work for the government, we're doing good things, we want people to know that. I think you can tell them that toward the end, you know, like, oh, and by the way, you know, we're federally supported, or your taxpayer dollars are paying for this after you've pointed out the good that you've done. And Jason, I don't know if you want me to talk about the age or the year stuff now.
Yeah, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay. So Jason talked about the federal labs and federal being, again, particularly the issue, but it's rather, this is one of those kind of surprises that we didn't necessarily think would happen, but several people reacted to the dates of the acts. And one person saying, why does it take so long to transfer technology? Thinking that it takes 40 years to do this, to do your work, because they see these dates. I do think the fact that the acts are ancient in tech terms speaks to a governmental issue of being behind in general. So the government's always lagging, and these acts show that. And then I find it to be outdated since a lot of things have occurred since 1980. That's given them a lot of time to figure out all the loopholes to make it null and void. So again, we may not want to give people the history lesson when we're first talking about this. And I've been to several tech transfer presentations where we start with, we're talking about this and we have, you know, Congress enacted this legislation so that we could do what we're doing. If you may recall from your own high school experience, I'll speak to only mine, history class was when I took a nap. So I don't think we're doing ourselves much service, good service, by necessarily starting with the enabling legislation and the dates of the acts. That's it.
No, thank you for that. So in the last part of the definition, again, reactions were a bit more positive here. And in particular, one of the sections that jumped out was the idea of collaborative partnerships. And one of the things, to put some additional context to this, we had as one of the policy items that we asked people about how they felt about an initiative that would provide federal resources to support state, local, higher ed industry partnerships to support regional innovation economies, or this is generally the wording. Again, if you're interested in those additional results, you can see them through the memo that we have linked at the end of the presentation. But that initiative was something that tested very well, had above 80% positive responses to the idea of doing that kind of collaborative partnership to support regional innovation. And so, you know, that seems to be a phrase or a concept. The idea of working together to try to address these issues does seem to resonate with an awful lot of people. Mark, any additional perspective on the last part here, or the definition overall?
I think just the issue of, you saw how long this definition was when it was on one slide. And I think by the time we got this far down, there was some fatigue. And people one person, or no, not one, several people liked that the idea of the government coming together with other organizations and to make this happen, and the idea of that movement of the work, the federal work, into other hands to put it to work. But then there were also people that were skeptical, and again, I think this is part of because we've put federal labs and federal government and Congress acts into so much of the definition that several people started to get suspicious and distrusting. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different comments where people are starting to wonder, maybe this collaborative stuff isn't so good. How involved does the government stay in the collaboration? How are companies selected? Sounds kind of fishy. Cronyism, payoffs? 3 people agreed with that one. How do these people coming together in these partnerships help my community? Emphasis on my. It sounds good, but government involvement gives them too much control of the program. Just look at how well the government is usually done with anything else they get involved with. And then if it ensures that the public benefits, that's one thing. But if it's just a way to help people make a lot of money for themselves, it's open to corruption and abuse. But that person voted that they were positive about the definition of tech transfer and the value of tech transfer, even though they were concerned about its implications.
So getting to the end of that, now that you've heard some of the responses people had to specific terms as well as the tech transfer definition overall, would love to invite you to share with us how you think you would define your work for the public, or as we'll talk about more in a moment, stakeholders that don't have a deep background in technology transfer. So particularly for those of you who do use something that's very close to the official definition when you talk about it, if you have thoughts on ways that you might change it, or for those of you, again, who do use the definition and shared that before, if you'd like to share what that actual definition is now, that would certainly be great. To address one of the questions that has come in while I'm giving everyone time to respond to that. So question was, I'm having trouble understanding why the general public even needs to understand technology transfer since they aren't directly involved. It seems more important for the private sector, Congress, and state and local governments. So certainly understandable question, and it's always very important to understand what the audience is that you're trying to communicate with when you're looking to put information out there. So obviously the audience here, when you're dealing with your federal technology transfer professionals, you can feel free to use your jargon. People are, at least most of the time, going to understand you. One thing that we found putting together conferences that deal with this type of policy space regularly, there is sometimes even some confusion among people who are in the field, but for the most part, you can use your jargon there for sure. Certainly when you're dealing then, anytime you are putting together information for the general public, you'd want to be very cautious, but there is a huge group of people in the middle that involve business partners, again, federal, state, local government stakeholders. And what I tend to see there, because we do a lot of work with SSTI, both with federal offices who, even the ones that are responsible for authorizing or appropriating funds to the work that you do, or to state officials, both in terms of the people who execute programs or the people who are in more of the legislative branch and looking to fund and authorize them, is that the understanding that those groups have as well is also extremely uneven. And I think this is probably true for many businesses too. And so I would lean towards, in your communications approach, and it's certainly something that I've done since 2015 that I think has worked pretty effectively, I would lean towards trying to make your communications, even for those stakeholders, much more in line with the way that you might communicate your work to the general public, thinking about trying to take out any terms that you think aren't clear on their face, like technology transfer, like commercialization, replacing that language instead with the general definition of what you're actually doing, making sure that you're tying back the impacts of your work as close as you can to a person like the audience that you're talking to, whether that's geographically or perhaps where they are in life or education level or the industry in which they work. Those different ways that you can try to make it as clear, as concise, and as directly relevant as possible, I think that's going to serve you really well, even if you feel that that person, by virtue of their job, should be able to meet you on your own terminology. I think it's a good. I think this study is a good reminder for all of us to try to not assume that and get out of that habit as much as possible. So, Mark, while a lot of people have been responding, so as I look through some of these to pull out, do you have any additional thoughts on audiences?
Yeah, I'll just, one quick comment, since you've got so many, I don't need to say a lot, but I think folks should remember, we have an image in our heads of what an elected official and a leader is, but at the same time, Congress is comprised of people who represent all sorts of different kinds of regions of the country, right? The activity within that region that's important to those people, the level of education of their constituencies, the level of education of the congressperson themselves, as well as city council members. People are elected for these jobs. They're not screened and interviewed based on their qualifications to handle and necessarily the topics that they're given in their committees and their roles. So I think that if you spend much time with the congressional representatives as well as their staff, who are brought in again to cover all sorts of topics, it's safer to assume they know nothing about what we do than it is to assume they're going to get tech transfer right away. And so that general public catering more toward, but not necessarily all the way down, but more toward the general public's understanding of what we're doing is only going to help us with a broader audience of decision makers and policy makers.
So go ahead. So again, thank you to all the people who are responding. John, Richard, Ron, Jack, Ann, Lisa, Kimberly, seeing lots of good responses here. We won't share them all. A handful of ones that I think are worth calling out right now. How research and development is converted into new products for public value, new businesses and jobs. Certainly hitting a lot of the highlights there that we've talked about that people respond to favorably. Engaged partnerships benefiting research, innovation, public health. Certainly that last one in particular, I think calls out an area of interest really nicely. One person says, we help business connect with and make use of the research facilities and scientists and engineers in Department of Defense labs in Maryland to help their businesses grow. Excellent. Yeah, note about the tiny chat box, but thank you for pushing through that. Very good. So yeah, I think those are all good examples of ways to really try to push the definition and put it more from the perspective of the person who's receiving that message. And there are other good examples here. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. And there's one more section that we want to make sure we go through too. But if we have time at the end, happy to dig into a few more of these in a bit more detail. In addition to talking about the terms and phrases that get used a lot in the field and how people respond to them, we also thought it was important to check in on how the public also perceives metrics. Obviously, many of the communications that you see put out in the field, and I'm sure many of you do as well, don't just talk about the stories, the general description of your work, but are also talking about the value, the measured impact of the work that you do. And so with that in mind, want to make sure that the metrics that you're working hard to actually measure and put out there are things that speak to the concerns of the public, who ultimately are the taxpayers, or in some cases, the stakeholders who decide how much funding you receive. So we asked people 2 questions about this. One, we asked them to share up to 3 items that they thought would be most important in the decision for whether or not a policy or program deserved to receive funding from the government. We asked them to respond to both most and to least. And so you can see in the green box there that number of jobs created was the overwhelming favorite of people in terms of being the most important metric. And then the amount of taxpayer dollars being spent was number 2. Average salary per job created was 3rd. And then it drops off a little bit from there, but number of new businesses, public revenues being spent also fall in, as well as who is receiving those jobs. In least important metrics, what really stood out here, especially if you look between the 2 lists, is that the public is really differentiating between what's an actual outcome of the program, or at least what you would hope would be an outcome of the program, versus what's a process measurement of what the program did. And so things that showed up in least important: number of events held each year, number of papers being published, number of people attending educational workshops, patent applications filed. We did ask separately about patents that were in particular was on this lower list. So again, you can see between those lists that people are looking in particular at what actually has an outcome that should have some sort of economic impact versus what's just a measurement of activity. again, we're not saying that you shouldn't necessarily measure other things just because something's on the least important list, don't measure it. It's important to understand your activity, to understand your funnel. But when you're having that communication with the public, being ready to talk about the jobs that came out of activities and understanding that those may be down the road and relatively small, but at least being prepared to speak to them, being able to talk about how much money you're actually spending, what the return is on that investment, certainly seems to be something that's going to help you resonate more effectively with those stakeholders. And actually, before Mark, I ask you to comment on anything that you have. Or how many of them include things that are on those least important metrics. So if you don't mind, again, some radical transparency here with the whole group, and let us know how you think your stories compare to these. And I'll pull that list back up again, perhaps. That's what I was afraid of. All right. Yeah, Mark, any comments you want to add while people are responding to that?
Yeah, I just want to say I wanted to include dozens of metrics that people use, but for the sake of getting responses, we could only include about 24, maybe up to 30. And folks were given the opportunity to select the 3 they liked most, the 3 they thought were least important. And that's how we were able to generate these kind of results. I think it's interesting as well. One metric there at the bottom of both columns showed up on both lists. And again, it's only 15% selected it, but that can be an issue important to certain regions and certain regions of the economy or of the country, and less important to those that might be more homogenous. But other than that, let's see what other people are saying so we can get to a live Q&A.
Yep. That sounds great. We did have one question from someone of whether we had asked about and I don't believe we did it here, although on the policy section, I think we kept an item in place that was about the kind of public benefits. But I don't think we have it on the metrics section here. Again, we did cut a number of them, unfortunately, due to time. All right.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't include the social and environmental outcomes.
All right, so I'm not seeing a lot of responses on whether people use these metrics, so something to think about perhaps in the future. Our final slide here is just sharing, again, those additional resources that I mentioned. If you're interested, please do feel free to follow up with us, whether to have a conversation about what we presented here, or if there are other items related to this study or anything else you'd like to talk, we're happy to engage in any conversations about this work. But if you want to look at the policy results that we had, the overall support that people have for science and innovation, as well as specific policy, relatively specific policy ideas that we shared, please feel free to check out these links.
Yeah,
and that concludes our Teresa and how they relate to the public at large. So one thing that I mentioned in passing before is that the survey part in particular was of likely voters. So it's slightly different than a general public survey. And so we did a double screen like you see in many political polls to try to make sure that the people whose responses that we were looking at are people who are very likely to vote. And so I think for the most part, the differences that you see in the demographics that we had in the survey are pretty reflective of the differences between likely voters versus the general public. It looked like we perhaps skewed slightly older, slightly better educated, but overall, I think it was a pretty good mix. I don't have the exact demographics in front, but I would say that with that kind of caveat about likely voters, it was a pretty broad mix of people. Yeah, I'll leave it there. All right, Narissa, I'm seeing a few people have their hands raised. If you want to, all right. So some of the other questions that we had chatted to us previously, one person commented in that the metrics show that the public does not understand what actual research is. I think that's fair. I assume that's a response in particular to seeing that people thought that scientific papers and patent applications were among their least important metrics we're rating poorly. To be a little bit fair to the public, that may absolutely be true. First of all, I'll say that may absolutely be true, that people don't understand what actual research is, but it may also reflect that they don't entirely care if that's what you're going to tell them the end value was of their research, of their taxpayer dollars, that they might not particularly care about that outcome, or at least they're more excited to see when the endpoint is further down the road and something that gets closer to actually being a new product in their pocket, a new job for experienced academically. Mark, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
I think too, we should remind people, yeah, no, just on that complex graphic of, the bar chart, scientific research was, I think, the second highest term as far as favorability. And so I think people understand science, and I think you're spot on, Jason, about it's the outcomes, how one interprets the outcomes of that research that matters. Yes, from an academic environment and for advancing knowledge, it's important for papers to be published and patents to be issued. But those are processes, right? Just like a CRADA is a part of the process. They don't care how we get there. They just want to see us get the results. So
when we see the follow-up there that he said, also looking at the salary per job, certainly fair. And our study, again, did not just look at the research side of this field. It also looked at innovation entrepreneurship programs. So certainly a response there. Although, again, technology transfer, especially with definition, talking about getting that to businesses, we were never really trying to ask people about just the research process either. And our metrics covered a slightly broader range. So, that is certainly fair to take that with a grain of salt. A question coming in asking us to summarize the lessons that we learned from our work and how you can use it to communicate. I'll start off with just one thing that has come really concretely out of it for me. So again, as I mentioned, in the role of policy director here at SSTI, I do a lot of communicating, in particular with the Hill, with a lot of offices, whether it's Science Committee or Commerce or Appropriations Committee, that are directly involved in supporting this kind of work. And starting with the 2015 study, I really pushed myself in the pieces that we put together as leave behind literature or in my direct in-person communications with staff members. I really try to stop assuming that they understand anything about what we're talking about based on these results, and really breaking things down very simply, even on broader, generally well-known programs like SBIR, that in many places just goes by that acronym, breaking that down completely too. And I think that'd be impactful in those kind of one-on-one communications circumstances. But Mark, what's your perspective on kind of bottom line takeaway that people should get from this?
Yeah, the bottom line is context, to think about who you're talking to try to come at it from their perspective, to check in with them to make sure they're understanding it. And you can't just say necessarily, do you have any questions, because they will nod if they want to just finish the conversation, but to try to figure out a way to really engage them. Part of what the study did was provide an example of something for people to react to, and the favorability, the reactions to it, regardless of party or age or any of that, scored above 94% all the time. And so that provided us a sense for what kind of tools should we use when we're communicating going forward. And I will say, to just be a little bit of, or not snarky, but I wonder, and I think I wondered this 5 years ago when we did the first study, but perhaps FLC would be well served to think about rebranding, right? And your own offices about rebranding, that federal lab and consortium's just really long and hard for people. Multiple syllables they don't seem to like. That we may just want to think about adapting our language overall, but keep it in context for who you're interacting with at that particular time. Don't feel like one brochure or one website's going to deal with everybody.
One comment that came in from someone is that they try to focus on qualitative results rather than looking at quantitative measures. One thing I know that I feel like I found in communicating at the federal and state level has been that there has been a shift back to appreciating qualitative and appreciating anecdotes even. And so people like to know that you have numbers there, but then they want to talk about your stories. And so being ready to have both, I think, is certainly very important and also effective. Question for people if you'll be able to download the full paper. So again, please feel free to reach out and email us, but it looks like the slides have been added into the control panel on your screen there. So if you pull those, the links are at the end as well. But again, feel free to email and happy to share those. Excellent. Well, I believe we are just about at the end of our run here, and I know that there are some additional announcements at the end. So Teresa, unless there are any final questions, happy to turn it back over to you. Yeah, so the memo and the top lines that we have from the study, again, those are linked at the end of the slides, and you can also feel free to email us for that too.
Okay, this concludes the webinar series. Thank you for attending the webinar. Please complete the webinar evaluation upon conclusion of the webinar. The webinar recording will be shared in 30 days after the meeting. Any questions, email Teresa Hurt at thurt@federallabs.org. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye, everyone.